Get the tape out of the trunk. Let's get to need more. They got cameras that come in and out of this place?
Yeah, they're checking on it right now.
Okay. I got a hold of the homicide detective. He's waiting on the official call. He was on our dead body. He knows about it.
Okay.
Because he's on.
You can call him back.
Yeah, he knows. We already told him.
Okay. I need you and your partner, if you will, for me. Run up here. So we want to cover that side to keep people from flowing through.
Okay, she's back over here?
Yeah. Do you want me to take her, or do you need to stay with her?
Let me go film. I've got this thing filming, so let me go film the scene right quick.
I received a phone call that there was a female that had been shot and killed in a parking garage in the part of Dallas called Uptown. It's a very affluent area. During my tenure in homicide, this is the only case that I've ever had in Uptown.
What's on the corner? May need to check
He was sitting right here with her.
Watch where you step. Step back over there for me, okay?
She was found with the door to her vehicle was open, and it was pretty clear that she had been shot in the head.
Next to her body was her cell phone and also a magazine from a handgun. The magazine laying next to the body is not something that we typically see. And so I believe that there was either a struggle or there was something that caused the shooter to leave a little faster than what he wanted to leave, which caused him to drop the magazine. The first thing that stood out to me was that there was no purse inside the vehicle.
At the outset of looking into it, it did appear to be a robbery. But again, that was what made it so unusual, because those types of things just have not taken place in that part of town.
We ran up the victim's license plate, and the vehicle came back registered to Kendra Hatcher, a pediatric dentist in the Dallas area. There was one camera that captured all the cars as they came into the parking garage and as they left. Reviewing the footage, I saw the victim pull into the parking garage. I don't think her car had even made it into the parking space yet before I see a dark figure walking over to her vehicle immediately. Like, it was dead on that was exactly what he was looking for. There was a short time frame between when the victim parked her car to the time that she was murdered. So I knew that she was an intended target of the shooting. Examining the suspect vehicle was an older model Jeep. There was paint flaking off of it, and it's not the typical car that you see in Uptown. We weren't able to see a license plate, but we took a still photo, kind of examined it, zoomed in, and we were able to determine that it was a female driver and she had brown hair. And I knew that the shooter got out of the passenger side of the vehicle. So there was at least two people in the vehicle.
We knew we needed to find the owner of that Jeep, and we felt that the public could help us with that.
So we pushed out a still photo on the evening news. If someone recognizes this Jeep, we wanted to give them the opportunity to give us a call. We're in a race against time, so I wanted to track down any evidence possible that we could use to put this murder together and figure out what the murder was about.
I got a message from one of Kendra's friends. All of a sudden, in one telephone call, boom, your world's upside down. Yep. I would describe Kendra as ambitious. Anything that she was passionate about, she did at 100%. And she went to dental school, but she always had that passion for Spanish too. For the church, she would volunteer her dentistry time for all the kids down in Ecuador. After everything went down, I was very confused because Kendra was loved by everybody. Nobody wanted to hurt her. So it was just very odd.
The staff at the apartment complex notified me that Kendra Hatcher She'd been living at that apartment building for several months. She never had any issues at the building, and she pretty much lived a very quiet life up until this incident. We learned Kendra had a significant other, so I made my way inside the apartment complex office, and I spoke with an individual named Ricardo Paniagua.
We found out Dr. Paniagua and Kendra had been dating and pretty much were head over heels for each other. They were making plans to get married and eventually moved to San Francisco.
He had no answers as to why someone would want to do this to Kendra. I couldn't see that there was anything that he was trying to mislead me on. He was just more distraught, trying to wrap his brain around the fact that the person he cared about was now dead. So at that point, what I focused on was just trying to figure out who it was that could have wanted the victim dead.
Dallas Police Department posted the vehicle over the local news stations, and the actual owner of the vehicle contacted the police.
I received a phone call from Jose Ortiz. He believed that that was his Jeep on the news. Jose, he's a mechanic, and that's what he does by trade. He said on September 2nd, the day of the murder, his childhood friend, Brenda Delgado, and one of her friends named Crystal came to his shop and needed a replacement vehicle while he did some work for them on Brenda's car. So he loaned his Jeep out to Brenda. Jose provided a cell phone number for Brenda, and I was able to call her on the spot and made arrangements with some of my coworkers to pick her up and bring her to the station.
There wasn't anything really remarkable about her background. She went to high school here. She enrolled in dental hygienist school.
She had never been arrested before, but as I was doing sort of background work, trying to pregame my conversation, Ricardo Paniagua, Kendra's boyfriend, he called me in a panic. He said that he saw the still photo on the news, and the female driving the vehicle had a strong resemblance to his ex-girlfriend, Brenda Delgado. What he told me was that he was in a long, drawn-out relationship with Brenda. They broke it off and several times rekindled the relationship, and things just kind of fizzled out.
He told us he just considered her a friend. In fact, the day and night that this happened, one of the first people he called to describe this horrific event or what happened was Brenda Delgado.
And obviously her name came up twice at this point. So talking to Brenda was the most important thing in the case. Keep it going. You mind switching chairs?
Oh, of course. Sorry.
Like I said, I appreciate you coming down to talk to me.
Yes, sir. Of course. Tell me what I can help with.
Okay. Well, I'm working a murder investigation. Your name came up in the investigation. So I wanted to sit down and talk with you.
Yeah.
Kind of figure out,
what's
going
on
and get your version of the events.
How did my name come up?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll explain all of that to you.
Yes, I want to know.
I decided to be very direct and upfront with Brenda because I wanted her to know that the situation was serious and I need to get straight to the facts on this case. Kendra Hatcher was killed on Wednesday, September 2nd. She was dating, I think, a guy that you used to date.
Mm-hmm.
The way that your name came up in the investigation was linked to the vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the Jeep,
Mm-hmm.
black Jeep.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recognize this vehicle?
That vehicle, I think that's my friend Jose's vehicle.
Okay. I talked to him earlier today. One of the things that he told me was that you dropped your car off at his shop and that you borrowed a vehicle of his.
No, it wasn't me.
Well, I definitely talked to Jose, and some things that he said are very different from what you're saying. And my problem is that I believe that that vehicle was used to commit this murder.
I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know if I was supposed to be angry or sad or it's disbelief. It's just that feeling of that your life just completely changed is probably the hardest thing to process.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit specifically about Wednesday, what you were doing Wednesday.
Wednesday, I was in Carrollton. I'm in school. I'm finishing school.
Okay.
I got a ride to Carrollton.
Okay.
And I studied from maybe 12 all the way to like about 6.
Who gave you a ride?
Who gave me a ride? My friend, Crystal.
Crystal?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then from Carrollton went to the Chili's off of George Bush. I have the receipt in my bag. I can tell you exactly. It's on my clothes now.
Okay. And you said you had the receipt in your bag?
Yeah. I can show you.
Yeah. Let's get that.
The murder took place at the same time. Brenda was at the restaurant. She immediately pulls out the receipt, and it's at the top of her wallet. It's neatly folded.
We closed out at 8:57.
Do you mind if I hang on to this?
Yeah, keep it.
It was just all too convenient. And for an experienced detective like Barnes, that's what immediately caught his eye, that something's not right here.
You recognize this guy?
Yes,
Who is that?
that's my friend Jose.
So Jose said that you dropped your car off at his shop on Wednesday, specifically Wednesday.
It was Crystal, my friend Crystal.
Okay. So did Crystal borrow a vehicle?
Yes, it was Crystal borrowed her vehicle to take me to the library.
Okay, so where did Crystal borrow one of his cars?
Yes, it was that car.
Crystal borrowed his Jeep. Okay.
She got it maybe like around 10:30.
You guys go to his shop on the way to Carrollton, and you guys borrowed the Jeep. She kept the Jeep.
Yeah, and then she had to go do some errands with her son and do some other things, and that's all I know.
Okay. What's Crystal's last name?
Cortez.
Okay. Because I got a very different story from Jose. He told me that he was working on a vehicle for you.
No. He didn't give me the car, he gave Crystal the car. I asked her, she said that she went to do errands and she went to find a parking space, and that's it. That's all, and she had her kid with her, that's all.
In a parking garage, or?
Yeah.
Are you and Crystal related?
No.
Okay, because I haven't seen Crystal, but I can tell you that that picture of the young lady driving that Jeep looks a lot like you.
No, she was driving. Crystal was driving that car.
Well, there's more to this situation than that. There really is. Okay. What I'd like to do is give Crystal a call and see if she can come down here. Does she have a car?
No, it's still not working.
Okay. We'll give her a call real quick, and I'll see if we can get her down here. Brenda said that her friend Crystal was inside the Jeep, in the parking garage. So I felt that getting Crystal in at the same time I had Brenda there would give me an advantage of kind of using them both against each other to get the tough answers that people don't normally like giving. We reached out to Crystal, and then I had coworkers pick her up and give her a ride to the office. And I knew that I needed to keep the conversation with Brenda going while I was waiting for Crystal. I didn't want her to ask to leave or for her to shut the interview down. The key thing in all this is you, okay? And I'm gonna tell you why. The Jeep, the way Crystal gets the Jeep is through you,
Yeah.
okay? The young lady that ends up dead, her boyfriend, the relation is you. You to him to her. Crystal ends up in this parking garage. Your friend's Jeep, your ex-boyfriend's girlfriend. All three of those things point back to you. That is you. You're the common theme in all of these things. So what I'm asking you is, how does this happen? There's more to this situation than somebody looking for a parking spot. Somebody looking for a parking spot never got anybody killed.
Yeah, I understand.
She was very unbothered, even by being at a police station talking about a murder. And I just couldn't find that emotion. That instantly is a red flag. If you can find that point to bring emotion into it, you can normally kind of break a person down and get the truth from them at that moment. When did you find out that his girlfriend was the one that was killed?
Oh,
That's
yesterday.
been on the news.
Yesterday morning.
And so did you say, well, maybe my friend who is in the news on this picture with this car, maybe she knows what happened, maybe she saw something, maybe she should talk to police, maybe she can help you find out who killed your girlfriend? Did you mention any of those things?
I didn't. I mean, I just didn't really think about it, you know. I was
You didn't think about it? You didn't call her to try to confirm? You know, did you see anything? Did you hear anything?
She said no. I mean, I said...
So you did ask her?
Yeah, I asked Crystal, but
What?
she said no.
Well, here's the thing. I'm gonna find out what happened to this young lady. I owe that to her family. I owe that to her mom. Just like I would do the same thing if something happened to you. Okay? I'm gonna step out for a minute. I will be right back. She was backpedaling and point blame every other place except for herself. It was only gonna go as far as Brenda wanted it to go. And so at this point, I knew Crystal was who I needed to talk to.
Hello, how are you?
Good, Crystal.
Good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Do me a favor and switch these.
Oh, no problem.
Okay. Your name came up in this investigation.
Understandable.
It was my understanding that on Wednesday, this past Wednesday, that's when the murder happened, that you were with Brenda and that you guys were hanging out.
Yep.
This is where we're at with this investigation. I know what happened. Okay? I'm fully aware of what happened, and I know that I know where you were parked at when this incident happened.
Yes, I was in the parking lot at the time frame. I heard the gunshot, and I'm fearful for my life. Yes, I was in downtown at that time frame. I wasn't parked though.
Okay, that is on video. It is on video.
Okay, I wasn't parked though.
No, that's not gonna work. This vehicle was parked on the first floor going down near the ramp going from P1 to P2.
Because I went to P2, but I just came in and out, and honestly, I had my son in there. I did. I don't have anything to hide, honestly.
No, that's not gonna work either. I know that what you're telling me is not true. What I'm telling you is that it is captured on video.
Right.
Okay? Here, I feel like I don't like all this stuff in this room. I moved the table out of the way because I wanted to get more of a personal connection with her. I could see, your leg twitching, or I can see when I ask certain questions, this is what her physical response is. And I didn't want her to feel like she could kind of hide behind the table any longer. Okay, well, tell me what happened.
Okay, I'm pulling in the parking lot. And before I pull in, there's a guy with a mask right in front of me. The guy gets in my seat, and he puts the gun right here. My son's in the back. My son is asleep the whole time.
The whole time?
He's like, don't look at me, don't say anything to me, nothing will happen to you or your kid. So he tells me to go in, go park. So then he gets off, and he mugs the girl. I don't know her name, I don't know anything about her. And he comes out, and he gets in the back seat, and he sits down, and he's like, drive, just drive. He says, I know exactly what your tattoos look like. I know if you say anything, I'm gonna come and get you. I booked it, and I dropped him off, and that was it. I called it a day. I don't want nothing to do with this.
What did he look like?
He has like medium dreads. It's kind of tall build, skinny, slim, honestly. I'm willing to take a polygraph. I'm willing to take a polygraph.
There's no need for that because you're not telling me the truth. You're not telling me the truth. You want me to believe that some guy hops in your truck and you don't know what's going on. Do you know who that young lady is that got killed?
No, I don't.
That's Brenda's ex-boyfriend's girlfriend. Okay, and I've been talking to her today before you got down here. You need to tell the truth.
I'm telling you.
No, you're not. You were inside a vehicle that was used in a murder. Why didn't you call 911 once you found out this happened?
Because I didn't know it was on the news until yesterday that I found out.
I mean, you knew somebody got shot.
I'm scared for my life.
I'm telling you right now, I don't believe this bullshit. You're telling me that you pulled in this garage into a cage and to sit here with the guy pointing a gun at you and your baby, and you think I'm gonna believe that? Nobody will believe that. Me or anybody else that hears this. Nobody is gonna believe that.
I understand.
Young lady, you don't understand. Whoever you're protecting is not more important than your son. That is not a decision I can make for you. Then you need to tell me the truth.
Brenda just wanted me to take her purse. That's it.
She wanted you to take her purse?
She wanted me to do it. $500 just to take her purse. Since I don't have a job, I'm not employed right now. I don't have money.
And how does this conversation start? Has she told you about this girl before? Or
No.
about her boyfriend?
No. It was like, X. That's how she refers to him. X. has a girlfriend. And I was like, okay. And she's like, I just want to know more about girlfriend. That's it. She's like, I'll pay $500 to take her purse, and that's it. I said, okay. And then I was like, well, I don't want to do that because I have a kid. She's like, well, we'll pay a guy to come in and take her purse, and they'll go from there.
Where do you find this guy at?
Just right there at the B&B pawn shop. There's a pawn shop right there. He's walking. I pull up. Hey, you want to make some
You pull up in the parking lot?
No, just driving by. You want to make some quick money? He said, yeah.
Murders just don't happen like that. People don't pick up strangers and two strangers hop in a car to go and steal someone's purse and someone ends up shot in the head. I just didn't buy that. There was more truth in that story than what she had previously told me, but I still wasn't where I needed to be with her. So you're sitting inside this Jeep, inside this parking garage. Why did you park where you parked at?
I wanted somebody to see me. I purposely parked there.
Okay, so...
Because I didn't know he had a gun. I really didn't know.
Show me right here. Draw me a nice picture of what this looks like from the inside of this place, where you parked at.
Okay, here's the main gate, right? There's two cars. I parked in between two cars. So he made me park there first because he said there was no cameras. And then I told him it was this and it's a white Toyota.
You show up there a little after 7 and you park. You sit there for a while and this car drives in. What do you hear?
No, 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 no.
Who's saying no?
I think it's the girl, Kendra. And I heard, no, 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 no. That was it. I didn't see how, where, what. I didn't know. I really didn't know he had a gun. He was just supposed to go in, get her purse, and we were supposed to leave.
Okay. When you asked the guy why did he shoot her, what did he say?
She was being stubborn and didn't want to give him the purse. I said, no, I'm going to jail. I have a son. And he said, well, you better not say anything because I'm going to kill you and your son.
What did you do after you left the garage with this guy?
I drove down, dropped him off where he told me to drop him off. I go get Brenda and I go home.
Did you tell anybody about this?
Nobody knows, nothing.
At that point, she just owned up to everything that had happened and her part in it. They have her in the vehicle. You can clearly see her. And that's enough probable cause for an arrest.
The information Crystal was able to provide for me basically gave me the foundation for the investigation, and that Brenda was the mastermind. Now I want to take this information and try to use it with Brenda to see if she gives me who the shooter was and what the motive was. Just got done talking to Crystal. Mm-hmm. We had a very interesting conversation. Mm-hmm. And I know that you haven't been truthful with me. Mm-hmm. Okay. I understand what it's like to want something that you can't have. I also know what it feels like to want something so bad that you're willing to do anything for it. Sometimes people do that for money. Sometimes people do that for attention. And sometimes people do that for love. Okay? And so what I'm asking you for is for the truth.
I mean, that's the truth. I was not driving.
Do you really expect for me or for anybody else to believe that this girl is dating this guy that you're still in love with, that's probably gonna marry this guy that you're still in love with? Do you expect the world to believe that you had nothing to do with this? That you didn't have anything at all, even though you made an arrangement for this young lady to get in this vehicle? You set that up. Crystal, she's got a very good description of how she ended up in that car and how she ended up in that garage that belongs to this young lady that's dating your ex-boyfriend, that you still talk to all the time, that you still converse with and share moments with. Yes. And it's not gonna take people a whole lot. This isn't rocket science. People will put this together very fast. That's why I'm asking you, why?
I'm telling you, there is no plan, there's nothing. There's no motive, I have no reason.
Oh, there's plenty of motive. There's plenty of motive. You cannot have him as long as she's alive. Everybody has feelings and everybody has a point where they break. Everybody has a wall. And that's what I think happened.
No, I mean, like I'm saying, it was just very casual.
Casual doesn't end up with somebody dead.
No, absolutely not.
So why do you want his girlfriend dead?
I don't. I didn't even know who he was seeing. I don't even know who he was dating.
Okay. You don't know. You don't know. Give me a second.
Can I just get my attorney at this time? Because I don't think I just need my attorney because you're not understanding me.
You can have your attorney. You can have your attorney, that's fine. So you're terminating this interview?
Yeah, I need my attorney because I'm done. I'm tired and I just need my attorney too.
Okay. All right. We were unable to charge her with murder at the time. We didn't have enough solid evidence, but Brenda had a couple of unpaid traffic tickets that had turned into warrants, and we decided to arrest her for her unpaid traffic tickets. We decided that she needed to go to jail, and that was all we could do at the time.
She immediately left the United States and headed to Mexico. It lets you know that you're on the right track, that this person is involved. And in fact, in court, flight can be introduced as evidence of guilt.
It was one of those things that where like it just kind of sucks the air out of you for a second. Once you step foot outside of the state of Texas, my badge is no good anymore. So at this moment, the focus of the case was now identifying the shooter. Crystal is our best witness. If we are gonna get Brenda, if we are gonna get a shooter, we're gonna have to use Crystal.
Crystal did a sketch.
What did he look like?
He has like medium dreads. It's kind of tall built, skinny, slim.
Crystal had also described the shooter having a scar on his hand. You want all the individuals that are involved in the offense, but almost certainly the person that had no qualms about getting out of a car and just shooting someone in the head, you're gonna want to get that person and get that person off the street.
We basically took Crystal's phone records, Brenda's phone records, and we were able to come up with a number that was similar to both records that they'd spoken with numerous times, and we found that number was contacted on the day of the murder.
They identify who the phone number belongs to, find out his name is Christopher Love. They're able to locate an actual photograph of Christopher Love, and he resembles the sketch that Crystal had provided.
One thing that I was able to learn about him is that he'd been arrested numerous times in his life, going all the way back to his juvenile years.
He's got a criminal history for some violent offenses, and he had also done some time for his involvement in those offenses.
I feel pretty good about the possibility that this is my shooter. So we did a ping order on the phone, which allowed for us every 15 minutes to track a physical location of this phone. The FBI noticed that the coordinates of the phone started moving at the same time a blue Chrysler Sebring was driving out of the parking lot. The FBI followed the blue Chrysler Sebring, and once an individual got out of the car, they made contact with him, and the individual was named Christopher Love. Outside of his physical appearance and similarity to the sketch, he also was in possession of this cell phone that had been in contact with Brenda and Crystal also on the day of the murder. The interview with Christopher was very challenging. He was pretty much unknown to the case until a few minutes before I'm sitting down with him in a room. The surveillance video of the murder, I couldn't 100% say that it's him because it's a grainy video. but I'm gonna work him as long as I need to get him to tell me the truth. My name's Detective Orange. I'm working a murder investigation. Your name came up during the investigation, okay? There was a dentist that was killed. Have you heard anything about that? And so I need to speak with you in regards to this murder. This is my partner, Cheney.
What's up, man?
Let me see your hands real quick, man. I was looking at your hands earlier. You got a scar right here on this hand. What happened to your hand right here?
Somebody shot me.
You got shot?
Mm-hmm. They tried to rob me in Memphis. They tried to carjack me anyway. The bullet hit my hand right there.
They noticed the scar on his hand that Crystal had described the shooter having. It's a match. That by itself is enough for what we call probable cause, but it wouldn't have been enough for a conviction.
Okay. Well, here's the thing, man. Me and my partner got called in on September 2nd to work a murder over in Uptown. You know where Uptown is in Dallas?
No.
Have you heard anything about that? There was a dentist that was killed.
A dentist?
A dentist. Kendra Hatcher was killed in a parking garage.
The kind of thing to me.
Okay. You know a female by the name of Crystal? You don't know Crystal Cortez? What about a Brenda Delgado?
No.
Have you ever seen this girl?
I don't think so.
Okay. What is it?
I don't know these people.
Let me ask you this. Have you ever rode in a black Jeep Cherokee?
I ain't riding no Jeep Cherokee.
Okay. Your name came up in this investigation as being friends with these two girls. that you know these two girls.
From where? Here?
Well, I don't know how you met them. That's why I'm talking to you today, to figure out if you do know them. And if you do know them, you know, maybe there's a reason why you know them.
No.
What I'm interested in is how your phone number would end up in these girls' phones.
I ain't gonna tell me. Probably weed.
You ever go to North Dallas? No reason your phone records would put you there either, is it?
Dallas people is crazy, man.
Why you say that?
Because of this. This is crazy right here.
What's crazy? What's crazy about it?
And I'm sitting in a homicide office and ain't did. Well, we got to clean this up, man.
This young lady right here was able to very distinctly provide me details about how you look and where she has been with you. Now, for her not to know you, she pulling a lot of damn details out of nowhere.
I understand that. And whatever you say is cool. But I didn't do this, bro. Now I'll ask you about the next girl lady. And which she's right here. To me, she's a lethal. And like lethal weapon. She's the one that, you know how when they put the when they looking at a crime family, they always have the top picture at the top, and then they have a spider web coming down. Her picture's up there. She's number one. You get what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, once we get her, when she says she know you, she point the finger at you. That don't know me. I don't know if she gonna point the finger at me because I can't control her. That's a yes or no question, sir. I just said she don't know me. No, she don't know me. Can I get something to drink?
Yeah, what you want to drink, man?
I want some coffee, but I'll take anything. Man, why does people talking like you are involved in this situation, man? That's what I'm thinking about right now. Huh? I said that's what I'm thinking about right now. And they providing facts of how to prove that you're involved in it. Man, I don't give a what they provide.
He's nonchalant, he doesn't know anything, he didn't do it. You know, this goes on for hours.
I don't have a good... A lot of times people call me for weed on my phone. I don't know them. I know I ain't never rode with them, for sure. Ain't no weapon. I got a charge right now for a weapon. These places ain't got no cameras. They where these ladies got killed. Come on, you know I got cameras. So they know what the shooter look like. It's a lot of stuff that is being done to this case.
So we're rolling into the next morning. At that point, we had been up all night, and we're taking a break from the interrogation to kind of refocus and reshift. One of my coworkers went out to the auto pound where Christopher Love's car was at, and the K9 began doing a sniff search on the blue Chrysler. The K9 alerted to gunpowder immediately, and they found a Smith & Wesson .40 caliber handgun tucked behind the center console and on the passenger side of the vehicle. The magazine laying next to the body belonged to a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun. We did ballistic testing, and we knew it was the firearm for the murder. It kind of gave me a second wind. Everything kind of opened up for me again, so I wanted to confront him with a picture of this firearm and give him an opportunity to explain it. We need to have a conversation, okay? We need to search one of your car. And we found a gun in your car. I found a gun in your car. All right. You ever seen a gun before? Who's got that?
Detective Barnes confronted him with a murder weapon, and then that's when you start seeing him being more willing to share information.
How did you get linked up with Brenda?
Crystal.
So give me a rundown of this day, man.
I got up, went over there, served a little weed and Crystal. She came over there about 5, and we rolled over there.
Where'd y'all go?
Downtown.
How did you know what time to be there?
I didn't. They knew all the information. All my information was to snatch an ID. I need the ID, the ID, the ID. That's all it was, ID.
Who else was in the car with y'all?
There wasn't nobody but us.
Her son went in there?
No. Yeah, no.
It was just you and Crystal in there?
Yeah.
What kind of conversation did you have with Brenda about this? Or what did she tell you?
She claimed they was the cartel. It was just like, go take this for the cartel and I'm gonna pay you.
And she told you she was from the cartel?
Yeah.
And Christopher is told that Brenda Delgado is with the cartel, and if he agrees to do this, she'll make sure that he has enough cocaine to sell for as long as he wants to sell cocaine. So in his mind, this is his way to go from being a small-time drug dealer to a big-time drug dealer. So he agrees to do it.
When y'all going to get Brenda?
We're gonna work on getting Brenda, man.
Cause she the f***ing puzzle y'all, the top of the puzzle y'all need.
Well, I mean, we're gonna go get her. You can promise that. You can be promised.
They been doing it, planning it or whatever they was doing. Whatever happened a couple months ago, 3-4 months ago. They've been watching this lady for 3-4 months.
Yeah, they ran some game on you. The girl that got killed was Brenda's ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend.
Brenda's?
Yeah. She didn't have nothing to do with any cartel. She was just a dentist. They go to work every day, just a regular person.
Fake ass mother cartel leader, some fake ass. Fuck that need to go to jail with me. No, I'm going to jail. They might as well go too.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go knock this paperwork out. It was a very quick and like short-lived round of high fives going around the office. But I think the immediate thing was, what can we do now to get Brenda in custody?
Brenda Delgado did not pull the trigger, but police say she planned and paid for others to carry out the heinous crime. Now she's become the 9th woman in history to make the FBI's 10 most wanted list since it began in 1950.
After placing her on this list, we started receiving phone calls relaying intelligence of where her whereabouts were at.
Did you kill that? Did you kill the dentist?
When I found out she was captured, there was a lady that was sitting next to me, a complete random stranger, explained everything. And I was like, can I have a hug? She's like, yeah, I gave him a big hug. And so yeah, overwhelming feelings of joy.
You introduced me to new feelings of absolute hatred and disgust, things I never thought I could feel before. Your ability to destroy lives both emotionally and physically is despicable and incomprehensible. You are a shame to humanity and you are a destroyer of lives. May God have mercy on you.
We tried Brenda's case 8 months later. Jury was only out 20 minutes before they came back with a guilty verdict. For capital murder, she received a life without parole.
Brenda Delgado, justice has been served for the people whose lives were touched in one way or another by this incredible, amazing woman who I was honored to be Kendra Hatcher's mother.
There is no reason in the world that that young lady should be dead. None. She's a completely innocent victim.
It started with a car that should never have been there. Late summer, 2003. Florida humidity hung thick in the air, the kind that turns every breath into something heavy. The road was empty, 2 narrow lanes cutting through miles of scrubland and pine, the kind of place people drive through but never stop. And yet, just before sunrise, a highway maintenance worker noticed a silver sedan sitting alone on the shoulder. Engine cold. Driver's door slightly open. No one inside. At first glance it looked like a breakdown. That happens all the time on rural Florida roads. A blown tire, a dead battery, someone hitching a ride to the nearest gas station. But this one was different. The car had been parked too carefully, too deliberately, pulled off the asphalt as if the driver had taken their time. The keys were still in the ignition. The radio still hummed faintly through static. And on the passenger seat a purse. Wallet inside. Phone inside. Everything a person would take if they planned to walk away. Except the person herself. Her name was Melissa Carter. 26 years old. Born and raised in a quiet neighborhood outside Tampa, the kind of place where neighbors wave across their lawns and everyone knows which dog belongs to which house. Melissa worked at a small insurance office downtown. She wasn't famous. She wasn't controversial. She didn't live a life that made headlines. Until the morning she vanished. The night before, she had left work just after 6. Co-workers later told detectives nothing seemed unusual. Melissa laughed at a joke near the copier, packed her bag, said she had plans to meet a friend later. Routine. Completely ordinary. But she never made it to that meeting. Her phone records would later show the last call she received came at 7:14 p.m. A number investigators couldn't immediately identify. The call lasted just 34 seconds. After that, silence. Somewhere between the insurance office and the lonely road where her car was discovered, something happened. And nobody saw it. When deputies arrived that morning, the scene already felt wrong. The open door creaked slightly in the warm breeze. Cicadas screamed in the distance. No skid marks on the road. No broken glass. No obvious sign of struggle. But the purse on the seat told another story. Inside were Melissa's driver's license, credit cards, even her car insurance documents. Tucked into a small pocket was a receipt from a gas station about 10 miles away. Timestamp, 7:42 p.m. That meant Melissa had been alive nearly half an hour after the mysterious phone call. Detectives traced the receipt to a small roadside station with flickering fluorescent lights and a grainy security camera pointed toward the pumps. The footage would become one of the most studied pieces of video in the case. There she was. Melissa Carter. Dark hair pulled back. Blue blouse from work. Standing beside the pump, filling her tank like any other driver passing through the Florida night. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Except for one detail investigators didn't notice until much later. Behind Melissa's car, just at the edge of the frame, another vehicle sat idling. A dark pickup truck. Headlights off. Waiting. At the time, nobody paid attention to it. The video quality was terrible. Just a blur of shapes and shadows. But when the footage was reviewed months later, frame by frame, zoomed and enhanced, that truck would become one of the most haunting clues in the entire investigation. Because it appeared again. Hours later. Parked less than a mile from where Melissa's car was eventually found. Back in 2003, though, detectives didn't know that yet. All they had was a missing woman and a car abandoned on a silent stretch of highway. And the clock was already ticking. Search teams combed the surrounding woods. Dogs sniffed through palmetto bushes and sandy trails winding deep into the brush. Helicopters circled overhead while volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder across miles of terrain. Nothing. No footprints leading away from the car. No torn clothing. No blood. It was as if Melissa Carter had simply stepped out of her vehicle and vanished into thin air. The disappearance hit the community hard. Melissa's parents appeared on local news stations begging for information. Flyers with her photograph were taped to telephone poles and storefront windows across the county. Missing. Last seen August 17, 2003. Police hotlines lit up with tips. Most led nowhere. A woman spotted walking along a highway 2 counties away. A waitress who claimed Melissa had stopped at a diner late that night. A truck driver who swore he saw someone matching her description at a rest stop near Orlando. Each lead investigated. Each one collapsing into nothing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And slowly, the case began to cool. But there was one moment early in the investigation that detectives would later replay in their minds again and again. A witness. Someone who might have seen exactly what happened. 3 days after Melissa disappeared, a man named Carlos Ramirez walked into the sheriff's office with a story that immediately caught investigators' attention. Carlos worked night shifts delivering produce to grocery stores across the region. On the night Melissa vanished, he had driven along that same quiet road sometime after midnight. And he remembered something strange. A car parked on the shoulder. Driver's door open. But there had been someone standing beside it. A man. Carlos couldn't see the man's face clearly. Just a silhouette in the glow of the moonlight. Tall. Broad shoulders. Wearing what looked like a baseball cap. At first Carlos assumed it was a stranded motorist checking their engine or making a phone call. But then the man turned suddenly toward the road. And Carlos felt a chill he couldn't explain. The man wasn't waving for help. He wasn't walking toward the driver's seat. He was just standing there. Watching the passing traffic. Watching Carlos drive by. And then Carlos noticed something else. Another vehicle parked further down the shoulder. A truck. Dark-colored. Engine running. Carlos didn't stop. Most people wouldn't. A lonely road at midnight isn't the place drivers pull over for strangers. But the image stuck with him. The open door. The silent man. The idling truck. When he saw the news report about Melissa Carter 2 days later, the memory came rushing back. Detectives immediately took Carlos out to the road to recreate the scene. He pointed to the exact spot where he believed the vehicles had been. It matched almost perfectly with where Melissa's sedan was later discovered. Which meant something chilling. If Carlos's memory was accurate, someone had been at Melissa's car hours after she disappeared. Someone who didn't belong there. Someone who might have known exactly what happened. Investigators began hunting for that dark pickup truck. Patrol officers checked registration records. They interviewed hundreds of drivers who owned similar vehicles in the area. But Florida has thousands of pickup trucks. And without a license plate or clear description, the lead went nowhere. Months later, detectives finally returned to the gas station security footage. That was when they saw it. The same shadowy pickup truck from Carlos Ramirez's story. Sitting quietly behind Melissa's car. Watching. Waiting. For years, investigators would chase that truck through rumors and dead ends. Anonymous tips. False sightings. Grainy photographs sent by people convinced they'd spotted it somewhere across the state. None of them held up. The truck remained a ghost in the background of the case. And Melissa Carter remained missing. By the time the first anniversary of her disappearance arrived, the search parties had stopped. Media coverage faded. The flyers on telephone poles curled and peeled under the Florida sun. But inside the sheriff's department, the file never closed. Because every detective who reviewed the case felt the same unsettling thing. Someone out there knew exactly what happened on that road. Someone had watched Melissa Carter leave her car that night. And that person had never spoken. Years would pass. New investigators would inherit the file. Technology would evolve. Evidence would be re-examined again and again. And slowly, buried deep inside the details of that long-forgotten night, something would emerge. A clue so small it had been overlooked for nearly a decade. A detail hidden in plain sight. The kind of detail that turns cold cases into headlines. And when it finally surfaced, it would shock the entire community. Because the truth about what happened to Melissa Carter might have been sitting in that investigation from the very beginning. Waiting. Silent. Just like the man beside the car on that empty Florida road, the file never really left the shelf. It just moved. Year after year, detective after detective inherited the same thick binder, photographs, transcripts, evidence logs, witness statements slowly yellowing under fluorescent office lights. The Melissa Carter disappearance became something every investigator in the county eventually encountered, the kind of case that lingers in the back of your mind long after the shift ends. Because something about it never made sense. People disappear all the time. Florida alone records hundreds of missing person cases every year. Most are resolved quickly: runaways, misunderstandings, domestic disputes. But Melissa's case had the kind of silence that investigators hate. No ransom calls. No confirmed sightings. No body. Just an abandoned car and a road that kept its secrets. By 2005, the investigation had already slowed to a crawl. Leads had dried up. The witness Carlos Ramirez had repeated his story so many times detectives could recite it themselves: the open door, the man standing beside the car, the pickup truck idling further down the shoulder. But without a face, a plate number, or a name, the story remained just that, a story. Still, some detectives couldn't let it go. One of them was Detective Alan Greer. Greer joined the sheriff's department 2 years after Melissa vanished. He was known for the kind of stubborn patience cold cases demand. The type of investigator who didn't mind sitting alone for hours, combing through paperwork others had already read a dozen times. The Melissa Carter file caught his attention almost immediately. Not because of what was in it. Because of what wasn't. There was no evidence Melissa had planned to disappear. Her bank accounts hadn't been touched. Her phone stopped transmitting after that last mysterious call. Her apartment remained exactly as she left it: laundry in the basket, groceries in the refrigerator, a calendar still hanging on August 2003. People who run away don't leave their entire lives behind. And people who are abducted rarely abandon their cars so neatly. Greer studied the crime scene photos over and over. The sedan parked straight along the shoulder. The driver's door cracked open about a foot. The purse on the passenger seat. Everything looked staged. Too tidy. Too deliberate. Then there was the timeline. Melissa left the gas station around 7:45 p.m. Her car was discovered shortly after dawn. But Carlos Ramirez claimed he saw someone standing beside the car after midnight. That meant the vehicle had been sitting there for hours before anyone noticed. And someone had returned to it during that time. Why? The question kept Greer awake at night. He began reconstructing the night in painful detail. Every mile Melissa drove. Every minute between the gas station stop and the abandoned car. 10 miles of road. 10 miles where something had happened. Greer drove that route himself, again and again. Sometimes during the day. Sometimes late at night, when the same darkness swallowed the highway the way it had back in 2003. What he discovered was unsettling. There were only 3 places along that stretch where a car could realistically pull over without drawing attention. 2 small gravel access roads used by maintenance crews and the narrow shoulder where Melissa's car had been found. Which meant something important. Whoever stopped Melissa likely knew the road. They knew exactly where they were going. That idea pushed the investigation in a new direction. Detectives began re-examining everyone in Melissa's life, co-workers, neighbors, former classmates, anyone who might have known her routine. At first nothing stood out. Melissa had no criminal connections. No dangerous ex-partners. No enemies anyone could identify. Her life appeared quiet, almost boring. But then investigators noticed something strange in her phone records. The unknown call at 7:14 p.m. The number had originally been traced to a prepaid phone, one of those cheap disposable devices that were easy to buy and nearly impossible to track. Back in 2003, that technology had frustrated investigators everywhere. But by 2006, forensic phone analysis had improved. Greer requested the records again. This time, analysts were able to identify the cell tower the call had passed through. A tower less than 3 miles from the gas station where Melissa stopped. Which meant the person who called her had been nearby. Possibly watching. Detectives tried to reconstruct the prepaid phone's movements through nearby towers, but the trail vanished after that one call. The device had never been used again. Another dead end. Still, Greer kept digging. He revisited the gas station footage, the grainy recording investigators had watched dozens of times already. The picture quality was terrible, but technology had advanced enough that analysts could enhance certain frames. They focused on the pickup truck. Frame by frame. Pixel by pixel. The truck remained mostly a blur. But one small detail began to emerge as the image sharpened. A sticker. Something on the rear window. At first it looked like nothing more than a smudge of light. But as the video enhancement improved, the shape became clearer, a circular decal. The kind people place on their vehicles to show support for a sports team, a business, or sometimes a local club. Investigators compared the shape against thousands of decals commonly sold across Florida. Eventually one analyst noticed something unusual. The design resembled the emblem of a small hunting association based about 40 miles away. The Gulf Ridge Sportsman Club. It wasn't proof. But it was a lead. Greer and another detective drove to the club one humid afternoon in early spring. The property sat deep in wooded land outside a rural town, an aging building surrounded by pickup trucks, dirt trails, and hunting blinds scattered across acres of brush. Inside, the club felt like a time capsule. Old photographs of hunting trophies lined the walls. Members gathered around worn wooden tables drinking coffee and swapping stories. Greer asked a simple question. Did anyone remember a member who owned a dark pickup truck with a circular Gulf Ridge sticker on the back window back in 2003? At first, nobody responded. Then an older man at the corner table spoke up. Actually, lots of members had those stickers. They used to give them out every year. That answer crushed the lead almost immediately. Hundreds of people could have been driving trucks with that decal. Too many to investigate individually. Still, Greer requested the membership records from 2003. The list contained nearly 400 names. Too many. But he didn't give up. Instead, he cross-referenced the list with another detail from the case, the mysterious phone call. The prepaid phone had connected to a tower near the gas station, which meant whoever used it was likely within a certain radius at that moment. Greer mapped the area. Then he compared it with the home addresses of Gulf Ridge Club members. Slowly, the list began shrinking. 400 names became 80. 80 became 30. 30 became 12. 12 men who were members of the hunting club who lived within range of the tower that carried the final phone call to Melissa Carter. For the first time in years, the investigation had real suspects. Detectives began quietly reviewing each name. Criminal histories. Vehicle registrations. Employment records. And that was when one name made Greer stop reading. Daniel Haskins. 39 years old in 2003. Construction contractor. Owner of a dark green Ford pickup truck. Registered less than 15 miles from where Melissa's car had been abandoned. But what really caught Greer's attention wasn't the truck. It was something buried deep in the man's history. In 1994, nearly a decade before Melissa disappeared, Haskins had been questioned in connection with another case. A woman reported being followed late at night while driving home along a rural highway. The driver behind her flashed his lights repeatedly until she pulled over, thinking something was wrong with her car. When she stepped out, the man approached. He claimed her tire looked loose. But something about him frightened her. She jumped back into her car and sped away. The woman later reported the incident to police. She had written down part of the truck's license plate. The vehicle belonged to Daniel Haskins. But the case never went anywhere. No crime had actually occurred. At the time it was just a strange encounter. Still, Greer couldn't ignore the similarity. A woman driving alone. A truck following behind her. A lonely road. The same pattern. Investigators decided to dig deeper. They pulled Haskins' employment records from 2003. And another coincidence appeared. On the night Melissa Carter vanished, Daniel Haskins had been working a construction job less than 10 miles from the gas station where she stopped. He finished his shift around 6:30 p.m. Less than an hour before that mysterious phone call. Greer stared at the file for a long time. It wasn't proof. But it was enough to reopen a door the investigation had nearly sealed shut. Detectives requested surveillance photographs from traffic cameras near the construction site. Back in 2003, very few cameras existed along those rural roads. But one intersection about 8 miles away had installed a system just months before Melissa disappeared. The footage had been archived. Buried on an old server. Forgotten. Until now. When technicians finally retrieved the video, the image quality was terrible. But one thing was visible. A dark pickup truck driving through the intersection at 7:32 p.m. Heading toward the same road where Melissa Carter would later vanish. The timestamp placed it just minutes before she arrived at the gas station. And investigators noticed something else. A faint circle on the truck's rear window. A sticker. The same shape seen in the gas station footage. For the first time in years, the ghost truck in Melissa Carter's case had a possible owner. Daniel Haskins. But even then the mystery wasn't close to solved. Because when detectives finally knocked on Haskins' door to ask questions about that night in 2003, the man calmly told them something that would complicate the investigation even further. He admitted he had driven that road many times. He admitted he owned a truck like the one in the footage. But he insisted on one thing. He had never met Melissa Carter. And he had never seen her car. Not that night. Not ever. The problem was investigators couldn't prove he was lying. Not yet. And as the questioning continued, another chilling detail emerged. A detail that would turn Melissa Carter's disappearance from a simple missing person case into something far darker. Because Daniel Haskins wasn't just a hunter. He was a man who knew those woods better than anyone. Every trail. Every hidden clearing. Every place where something could disappear and never be found. Daniel Haskins did not look like the kind of man who made headlines. When detectives first saw him standing in the doorway of his modest Florida home, he appeared almost forgettable. Early 40s now, heavier than in the old photographs investigators had pulled from the 1990s. A work-worn face, sunburned skin, calloused hands that spoke of years spent outdoors and on construction sites. Nothing flashy. Nothing threatening. Just another man living quietly in a rural corner of the county. Which, in many ways, made the situation even more unsettling. Because when detectives Greer and Martinez introduced themselves and mentioned Melissa Carter's name, Haskins didn't react the way most people would. There was no confusion. No hesitation. Just a long pause. And then a small, almost practiced shrug. Never heard of her? The answer came quickly, too quickly for Greer's liking. Most people, when asked about a missing woman from years ago, would search their memory. They'd ask questions. They'd show some kind of reaction. But Haskins didn't. He simply stepped aside and invited the detectives in. Inside, the house smelled faintly of motor oil and dust. Tools hung neatly on a pegboard near the kitchen. Hunting magazines were stacked on the coffee table, some dating back more than a decade. On the far wall, mounted deer antlers cast long shadows beneath a flickering ceiling light. The room felt still. Controlled. Greer had conducted hundreds of interviews during his career. He knew the rhythm of conversation when someone was hiding something. The small delays. The nervous gestures. Haskins showed none of that. He answered every question calmly. Yes, he had been a member of the Gulf Ridge Sportsman Club. Yes, he owned a Ford pickup truck in 2003. Yes, he had driven along that stretch of highway many times. But no, he had never seen Melissa Carter. Not that night. Not ever. The interview lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, Greer stepped outside with a familiar frustration gnawing at the back of his mind. There was something wrong about the man. Something cold. But suspicion wasn't evidence. And after so many years, evidence was exactly what the case lacked. Still, investigators weren't ready to walk away. They began watching Haskins quietly. No arrests. No accusations. Just observation. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. Haskins lived alone. No wife, no children, no long-term relationships anyone could identify. His neighbors described him as quiet but polite. The type of man who waved from his driveway and kept mostly to himself. He worked steadily as a contractor. Paid his bills. Never caused trouble. On paper, Daniel Haskins lived an ordinary life. Yet something about his routine stood out. Almost every weekend, he disappeared into the woods. Not unusual for a hunter, of course. Florida's rural counties are filled with people who spend their days tracking deer, hogs, or wild turkey through thick pine forests. But Haskins didn't always go to the official hunting areas. Instead, he drove deep into sections of land few people visited. Overgrown logging roads. Abandoned clearings. Old trails barely visible beneath layers of sand and brush. Greer studied satellite images of those areas late into the night. The terrain was vast. Miles of woodland where a person could vanish without leaving a trace. The thought haunted him. Because if Melissa Carter had been taken there, the chances of ever finding her were painfully small. Still, Greer wasn't ready to give up. He returned again and again to the gas station footage. The pickup truck behind Melissa's car. The sticker on the rear window. And the timing. The truck appeared just minutes after Melissa arrived. Not before. Which meant something important. The driver likely saw her pull in. Maybe even followed her there. That idea led investigators back to the mysterious phone call at 7:14 p.m. The prepaid phone that contacted Melissa shortly before she stopped for gas. For years, the number had been a dead end. But technology had improved. And by 2008, forensic analysts were capable of extracting far more information from old telecommunications records than anyone thought possible back in 2003. Greer submitted the case files for another review. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, the lab called. They had found something. It wasn't the caller's identity. Not yet. But analysts discovered the prepaid phone had briefly connected to another tower earlier that evening, one located near the construction site where Daniel Haskins had been working. The connection lasted less than 10 seconds. Just long enough to register the device on the network before it moved out of range. But the timing was troubling. It happened at 6:41 p.m. 11 minutes after Haskins finished his shift. Greer stared at the report. 2 towers. One near Haskins' workplace. One near the gas station where Melissa stopped. And between them a stretch of road leading straight toward the location where her car was later found. It wasn't proof. But the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Detectives returned to the Gulf Ridge Sportsman Club, hoping someone might remember more about Haskins. This time, they spoke with a man named Walter Briggs, one of the club's longest-standing members. Walter had known Haskins casually for years. When detectives asked about him, Walter hesitated before answering. Danny kept to himself, he said slowly. Always polite. But there was something about him. Greer leaned forward. What kind of something? Walter rubbed his chin. Hard to explain. You ever meet someone who just watches people too much? The words hung in the air. Walter continued. A few of the guys joked about it back then. Said he'd sit quiet at the bar during club meetings, barely talking. Just looking around the room like he was studying everyone. Did he ever cause problems? Greer asked. Walter shook his head. No. Never did anything illegal far as I know. But there was one time something strange happened. The room grew quieter as Walter told the story. It was sometime in late 2003, just months after Melissa Carter disappeared. The club had organized a group hunting trip in a remote patch of forest owned by one of the members. Several trucks parked along a dirt trail early that morning. Men unloading rifles, coolers, and gear while the sun crept over the tree line. But one truck stood out. Daniel Haskins' truck. Because when the others arrived, he was already there. Parked alone near the edge of the woods. Walter remembered asking him how long he'd been out there. Haskins simply shrugged and said a while. But what bothered Walter wasn't the timing. It was the look on Haskins' face. He looked tired, Walter said. Like he hadn't slept in days. Greer asked the obvious question. Did anyone see where he'd been hunting? Walter nodded slowly. Yeah. One of the guys followed his tracks out later that day. Just curious, you know. And? Walter's voice dropped. They didn't lead to any hunting stand. The trail ended near an old clearing deep in the woods. No deer signs. No animal tracks. Just disturbed soil and a patch of ground that looked like it had been recently dug. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Hunters dig all kinds of things in the woods, fire pits, trenches, makeshift blinds. But now, years later, the memory felt different. Darker. Greer felt the air in the room grow heavier. Did anyone report it? He asked. Walter shook his head. No reason to. We figured Danny was just burying trash or something. But the story didn't leave Greer's mind. A clearing in the woods. Freshly disturbed soil. Just months after Melissa Carter vanished. The next morning, investigators returned to those woods with search teams and ground-penetrating radar. The forest had changed over the years. Trails had shifted. Trees had grown thicker. But using Walter's description and old maps, they eventually located the clearing. It was smaller than Greer expected. Just a patch of open land surrounded by tall pines, sunlight breaking through the canopy in scattered beams. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But when the radar equipment scanned the ground, a faint anomaly appeared beneath the soil. Roughly 6 feet long. 3 feet wide. The shape was unmistakable. A grave. For a moment, nobody spoke. Years of unanswered questions hung in the still air as investigators stared at the screen. If Melissa Carter was buried here, then after all this time, the mystery might finally be ending. But when the excavation began, the truth that emerged from the earth was something none of them expected. Because the grave did contain remains. Human remains. But they didn't belong to Melissa Carter. And that discovery would send the entire investigation spiraling in a direction no one had imagined. Because suddenly, detectives were no longer searching for one missing person. They were looking at the possibility of something far more terrifying. A predator who had been hiding in plain sight for years. A man who knew these woods intimately. A man who might have been burying secrets beneath the soil long before Melissa Carter ever drove down that lonely Florida road. The moment the first bone appeared in the dirt, the entire clearing fell silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Forensic technicians knelt carefully around the excavation site, their gloved hands brushing away layers of sand and loose soil with slow, deliberate movements. Every inch mattered now. Every fragment could mean the difference between solving a mystery and burying it forever. Detective Alan Greer stood at the edge of the clearing, staring down at the shallow grave. For years, the Melissa Carter case had been nothing but questions. Now the ground itself was beginning to answer. But the first answer was the wrong one. Because the bones emerging from the soil clearly did not belong to Melissa Carter. The forensic anthropologist on site noticed it immediately. The structure of the pelvis, the proportions of the skull fragment, the length of the femur, all of it pointed to something investigators had not expected. The remains belonged to a man. Roughly mid-30s to early 40s. Dead for years. Greer felt a strange chill crawl across his spine. Melissa Carter was still missing. Which meant whoever had buried this man in the woods might have buried others. The excavation expanded quickly. Crime scene tapes surrounded the clearing while technicians documented every layer of soil, every artifact uncovered beside the skeleton. There wasn't much. No wallet. No jewelry. No clothing except for a few scraps of fabric too decayed to identify. But there was one object that immediately caught the attention of investigators. A small brass key. It had been buried beside the body, partially wrapped in what looked like the remains of a cloth pouch. Greer picked it up carefully using evidence tweezers. The key was old-fashioned, the kind used for padlocks or storage units. Stamped on the metal surface were 3 tiny letters. GRS. Greer didn't need to ask what it meant. Gulf Ridge Sportsman. The same hunting club Daniel Haskins had belonged to for years. The same club that had led investigators to this clearing in the first place. The connection was impossible to ignore. But before anyone could jump to conclusions, the remains had to be identified. The bones were transported to the county medical examiner's lab where forensic experts began the slow process of reconstruction. DNA samples were extracted. Dental structures were compared against missing persons databases stretching back decades. Days passed. Then weeks. During that time, detectives quietly continued watching Daniel Haskins. If he knew investigators had discovered something in the woods, he didn't show it. His life went on exactly as before. Work during the day. Trips to the hardware store. Occasional visits to a small roadside diner where waitresses knew him simply as Danny. Nothing about his behavior suggested panic. Nothing suggested guilt. In fact, if Haskins noticed the unmarked vehicles occasionally parked down the street watching his house, he gave no sign. That calmness unnerved Greer more than anything else. Most people, when they suspect police might be investigating them, change their routines. They become cautious, nervous. Haskins did neither. He simply continued living. Meanwhile, the forensic lab finally delivered an answer about the skeleton. The remains belonged to a man named Robert Leland. The name didn't mean much to investigators at first. But when they pulled his file from the archives, the case suddenly became much bigger. Robert Leland had been reported missing in 1998. 5 years before Melissa Carter disappeared. Leland had been a mechanic who lived about 30 miles from the woods where his body was discovered. According to the original report, he vanished after leaving a bar late one night. His car had been found abandoned in a grocery store parking lot 2 days later. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. The case eventually went cold. Until now. Greer stared at the file with growing disbelief. 2 missing persons. 5 years apart. Both connected by the same remote stretch of forest. And possibly the same man. The discovery forced investigators to widen their investigation immediately. If Daniel Haskins had anything to do with Robert Leland's death, then Melissa Carter's disappearance might only be part of a much darker story. Detectives began digging deeper into Haskins' past. Every job he'd worked. Every address he'd lived at. Every person who had crossed paths with him. Slowly, a pattern began to form. Haskins had moved around frequently in the 1990s, working construction projects in rural areas across central Florida. Small towns. Isolated highways. Places where people could disappear without drawing national attention. And in several of those places, investigators noticed something troubling. Unsolved disappearances. Not many. Just enough to raise questions. A waitress who vanished after closing a diner late at night. A hitchhiker last seen climbing into a pickup truck along a rural highway. A convenience store clerk who walked out during a smoke break and never came back. Individually, none of the cases had ever been connected. But looking at them together, through the lens of Haskins' movements across the state, they painted a disturbing possibility. Greer began mapping the locations on his office wall. Pushpins marked each disappearance. Another pin marked the Gulf Ridge woods where Robert Leland had been buried. Then he added one more. The lonely road where Melissa Carter's car had been found. The pattern that emerged was chilling. A loose triangle of highways and forests stretching across 2 counties. Places where a predator could operate quietly for years. But Greer knew something else. If Haskins was responsible for any of those disappearances, there had to be mistakes somewhere. No one commits crimes for decades without leaving traces. And traces meant evidence. The break investigators needed came from an unexpected place. A retired sheriff's deputy named Mark Holloway. Holloway had worked missing persons cases during the late 1990s, including Robert Leland's disappearance. When news spread that Leland's body had finally been discovered, Holloway contacted the department with a memory he hadn't thought about in years. Back when Leland first vanished, police had interviewed dozens of people who had been at the bar that night. One witness mentioned seeing Leland arguing with a man in the parking lot shortly before midnight. The witness couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but they remembered the other man's vehicle. A pickup truck. Dark green. Holloway had written it down in his report. At the time, investigators couldn't identify the truck or its owner. The witness didn't know the man's name. So the lead faded away. But when Greer heard the description, his pulse quickened. Dark green pickup truck. The same type of vehicle Daniel Haskins had owned in the early 2000s. Greer reopened the old witness statement and studied it carefully. The witness had described something else about the truck. A sticker on the rear window. Round. Circular. just like the one seen in the gas station footage years later. Suddenly the timeline expanded. If the witness was correct, Daniel Haskins may have been involved in Robert Leland's disappearance in 1998. Which meant he had potentially been getting away with something for far longer than anyone realized. Greer returned to the woods with a new sense of urgency. If Leland had been buried there, what else was hidden beneath that forest floor? Search teams expanded their grid across several acres surrounding the original grave site. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the terrain slowly, hour after hour. At first the screen showed nothing but roots and natural soil disturbances. But then another anomaly appeared. 50 yards deeper into the trees. Another shape beneath the ground. Smaller than the first, but unmistakably human-sized. The team carefully marked the location. Greer felt his chest tighten as the excavation began. If another body lay beneath the soil, the investigation was about to explode. But when the shovels finally broke through the surface, the discovery stunned everyone standing there. Because the grave wasn't empty. And it wasn't old. The soil was loose. Fresh. As if someone had dug it recently. Very recently. The pit held a black plastic tarp partially buried beneath the sand. And inside that tarp investigators could already see something pale beginning to emerge. Bones. But these bones were different. Smaller. Delicate. And unmistakably female. For a moment, Greer felt hope surge through him. After all these years, could this finally be Melissa Carter? But the medical examiner kneeling beside the grave shook his head slowly. Too small, he whispered. This isn't her. Which meant something even more terrifying. Someone had returned to the woods recently. Someone had dug another grave. And if the timeline was correct, that someone might still be out there. Walking free. Possibly watching the investigation unfold. Possibly watching the same forest where investigators were now uncovering the secrets buried beneath the sand. And if Detective Greer's growing suspicions were right, there was only one person who knew those woods well enough to hide bodies there without ever being noticed. Daniel Haskins. The quiet man with a dark pickup truck. The hunter who had spent decades wandering the forests of Florida. A man who might have been hiding far more than anyone ever imagined. The forest had begun to feel different. Before the first grave was discovered, the clearing in the Gulf Ridge woods had been nothing more than a quiet patch of land surrounded by tall pine trees and tangled underbrush. Wind moved softly through the branches. Insects hummed in the humid Florida air. It was the kind of place hunters passed through without a second thought. But now every inch of ground felt heavy with possibility. Secrets. Detective Alan Greer stood beside the second excavation site as technicians carefully peeled back the black plastic tarp buried beneath the sand. The smell reached them before the remains were fully exposed, a faint, stale odor that clung to the air even after years underground. The bones inside the top were arranged unevenly, as if whoever buried them had worked quickly. Not with the careful patience of someone hiding a body permanently, but with urgency. The medical examiner crouched beside the grave, studying the skeletal structure as more soil was removed. Female. Small frame. Younger than the male remains found earlier. But still not Melissa Carter. That fact hit Greer with a strange mixture of disappointment and dread. If Melissa wasn't here, then she was still somewhere else. And the woods had just proven they could hide bodies for years without anyone noticing. The top was lifted gently and placed inside an evidence container. Nearby technicians photographed every inch of the pit, documenting tool marks, soil disturbances, anything that might reveal how recently the grave had been dug. The answer came quickly. Very recently. Weeks. Maybe even days. The soil hadn't settled yet. Which meant whoever buried the body could have been in these woods not long before investigators arrived. Greer scanned the surrounding trees instinctively, as if expecting someone to be watching from the shadows. The thought wasn't irrational. If Daniel Haskins had been using these woods for years, he likely knew every trail and clearing better than anyone else. He might even know the investigation had returned to the area. But the forest remained silent. The team continued searching. As the sun climbed higher, the heat grew suffocating. Sweat ran down Greer's neck as he watched the ground-penetrating radar slowly sweep across the terrain again. Another anomaly appeared. Then another. By the end of the afternoon, 3 additional spots had been marked for excavation. The forest was turning into a graveyard. Back at the sheriff's department, the atmosphere had changed completely. What began as a reopened cold case was rapidly transforming into something far larger, a potential serial homicide investigation stretching back decades. News of the discoveries hadn't been released to the public yet, but inside the department word was spreading fast. Detectives pulled old missing persons files from storage. Unsolved disappearances from the late 1990s. Early 2000s. Each file carried the same terrible possibility. Could they be buried in those woods too? Meanwhile, investigators kept a close eye on Daniel Haskins. Unmarked cars watched his house day and night. If he noticed, he didn't react. That calmness continued to bother Greer. Because if Haskins was responsible for the bodies in the woods, he had just learned something dangerous. The police were digging. And yet he showed no sign of fear. No attempt to flee. No sudden change in routine. Instead, 3 days after the second grave was discovered, Haskins did something unexpected. He went hunting. Early Saturday morning, his dark pickup truck left the driveway and headed north toward the rural highways that cut through the forest. Greer received the call immediately. Surveillance units followed at a distance, careful not to alert him. The truck drove for nearly an hour before turning onto a narrow dirt road that disappeared beneath thick tree cover. The same road leading toward the Gulf Ridge hunting land. Greer's pulse quickened as the radio crackled with updates. Target vehicle entering the woods. Speed slow, looks like he knows the trail. Still moving north. Every mile deeper into the forest made the situation more tense. If Haskins had discovered investigators searching the area earlier in the week, he might be heading out there now for a reason. To check something. To move something. Or worse, to destroy evidence. The surveillance team stopped their vehicles about half a mile from where Haskins had parked. Beyond that point, the terrain became too rough for the unmarked sedans. Officers continued on foot. The wood swallowed sound quickly. Pine needles softened every step. The only noise came from insects buzzing through the thick summer air. Then someone spotted the truck. Parked beside a small clearing. The same clearing where investigators had discovered Robert Leland's grave days earlier. Greer crouched behind a cluster of trees and watched. Haskins stood near the edge of the clearing, looking toward the disturbed soil where crime scene tape still fluttered weakly between wooden stakes. He didn't approach the graves. He didn't dig. He simply stood there. Watching. For nearly 10 minutes he remained completely still. Then something strange happened. Haskins smiled. Just a faint expression, barely visible from the distance. But unmistakable. Greer felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Most people would react with fear or panic if they discovered police investigating a location connected to them. But Haskins looked amused. As if the entire situation confirmed something he already knew. After a moment, he turned and walked back to his truck. The engine started. The vehicle disappeared down the trail. The surveillance team followed again from a distance, but Greer couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted in the investigation. It felt like a silent message. The kind that didn't require words. Back at the forest clearing, excavation teams continued their work over the following days. 2 more graves were uncovered. Both containing skeletal remains. Both years old. 1 male. 1 female. None of them Melissa Carter. Forensic teams worked around the clock identifying the victims. The female skeleton from the top was eventually matched to a missing woman named Angela Vickers. She had disappeared in 2005. 2 years after Melissa Carter vanished. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department. If Angela Vickers had been buried in the same woods years later, that meant something terrifying. The killer had continued operating long after Melissa disappeared. And if Daniel Haskins was responsible, he had been doing it while investigators were still searching for Melissa Carter. The timeline grew darker with every new piece of evidence. Greer pinned Angela's photograph beside Robert Leland's on the wall in his office. 2 victims now confirmed. Possibly more. And one suspect whose quiet life suddenly looked very different under the weight of those discoveries. But there was still a problem. Investigators had circumstantial evidence linking Haskins to the woods. They had witness accounts describing a truck like his. They had phone tower records placing him near Melissa Carter the night she vanished. Yet none of it proved he had committed murder. Not legally. Not in court. Without direct evidence connecting him to the bodies, the case remained frustratingly incomplete. Greer knew they needed something stronger. Something undeniable. The breakthrough came from a piece of evidence investigators had nearly forgotten. The brass key found beside Robert Leland's remains. The small key stamped with the letters OGRS. At first, it seemed like little more than a curiosity. But when detectives visited the Gulf Ridge Sportsman Club again, an elderly member finally recognized it. The key didn't belong to a hunting locker. Or a storage shed. It belonged to something else. A private equipment box used by certain members years ago, small metal lockers installed behind the main clubhouse where hunters stored gear between trips. The boxes had been removed around 2006 when the club renovated the building. Most members emptied them out and took their belongings home. But records showed which locker belonged to which member back in the early 2000s. Greer asked for the list. When he saw the name attached to locker number 14, his heart began pounding. Daniel Haskins. And suddenly the meaning of the key became chillingly clear. If Robert Leland's body had been buried with the key to Haskins' locker, it might not have been an accident. It might have been something far more deliberate. A mistake. Or a message. Either way, investigators now had a reason to search the one place they hadn't looked yet. Daniel Haskins' house. Because if the woods held the bodies, the truth about Melissa Carter might still be hiding somewhere much closer to home. The warrant took 2 days. 2 long days where the investigation seemed to hover in a fragile balance between breakthrough and collapse. Detectives knew they were close to something, closer than they had been in the entire history of the case, but without legal authority to search Daniel Haskins' property, they were stuck watching from the outside. And Daniel Haskins continued living his life as if nothing had changed. He drove to work every morning at the same time. He stopped at the same diner for coffee twice that week. One afternoon he even helped a neighbor repair a fence along the edge of their property. Ordinary. Calm. Too calm. Detective Alan Greer spent most of those 2 days staring at the growing evidence wall in his office. Photographs of the forest graves were pinned beside the faces of the victims now slowly being identified through DNA analysis. Robert Leland. Angela Vickers. 2 names confirmed. Possibly more still buried beneath the soil. And hovering in the center of the board, like the quiet gravity pulling everything together, was the photograph of Daniel Haskins. The quiet man with the pickup truck. The hunter who knew those woods better than anyone. The man who had smiled when he saw investigators digging. Greer replayed that moment in his mind again and again. Why smile? The question bothered him more than anything else. Because it suggested something disturbing. Haskins wasn't afraid. He believed he was untouchable. And that belief meant one of 2 things. Either he truly had nothing to do with the graves, or he was very confident investigators would never find what they were looking for. On the 3rd morning, the search warrant was finally approved. By noon, a convoy of sheriff's vehicles rolled quietly into the rural road where Daniel Haskins lived. Neighbors stepped onto their porches as deputies approached the small house. The sudden presence of uniformed officers created a ripple of curiosity through the quiet neighborhood. When detectives knocked on the door, Haskins answered almost immediately. He looked from the warrant to Greer's face without showing the slightest trace of surprise. "You boys finally decided to come inside," he said calmly. The remark sent a chill through Greer. Haskins stepped aside without resistance. "Help yourselves." The house looked exactly the same as it had during the earlier interview. Tools neatly arranged on the walls. Hunting gear stored in plastic bins near the garage. Old magazines stacked on the coffee table. Nothing about the place looked like the home of a man hiding dark secrets. But Greer knew better than to trust appearances. Search teams moved through the rooms methodically. Every drawer was opened. Every closet examined. Evidence technicians photographed and catalogued everything. At first, nothing unusual appeared. Kitchen cabinets contained ordinary dishes and canned food. The bedroom held little more than clothes and an aging television set. The bathroom revealed nothing beyond a few bottles of medication and basic toiletries. If Haskins had committed crimes, he had hidden the evidence well. But Greer kept thinking about the key. Locker number 14 at the Gulf Ridge Club. And the man buried beside it. That key had to mean something. Then one of the deputies called out from the garage. "Detective, you might want to see this." Greer walked out to find the deputy kneeling beside a large metal toolbox sitting beneath a workbench. The toolbox itself wasn't unusual. What caught their attention was the lock. A small brass padlock. Stamped with 3 familiar letters. GRS. Greer felt the air leave his lungs slowly. Gulf Ridge Sportsman. The same marking that had been found on the key buried beside Robert Leland's remains. The deputy carefully unlocked the box. Inside were dozens of small items neatly organized in plastic bags. At first glance, they looked harmless. Random objects collected over the years. A wristwatch. A pair of earrings. A pocket knife. Several old keys. But as Greer studied them more closely, the pattern became horrifyingly clear. These weren't random objects. They were personal belongings. Keepsakes. Souvenirs. Each one carefully preserved. Each one potentially belonging to someone who had disappeared. Greer felt a heavy silence settle over the garage. This was the moment every investigator in the room understood what they were dealing with. Daniel Haskins hadn't just buried bodies in the woods. He had kept reminders of them. Back in the living room, Haskins sat calmly at the table while deputies continued searching his house. When Greer placed the brass padlock on the table in front of him, Haskins studied it with mild curiosity. "Find something interesting?" he asked. Greer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed several of the items from the toolbox beside the lock. The earrings. The watch. The pocket knife. Where did these come from? Greer asked quietly. Haskins leaned back in his chair. Garage sales. Flea markets. You know how it is. Greer slid a photograph across the table. Angela Vickers. The woman whose remains had been found wrapped in a tarp beneath the soil. Did you buy these from her too? For the first time, Haskins hesitated. Only a second. But Greer saw it. Then the man smiled again. That woman's been missing for years, hasn't she? The answer confirmed something Greer already suspected. Haskins knew exactly who she was. But he wasn't done yet. Greer placed another photograph on the table. Robert Leland. Remember him? The smile faded slightly. Still, Haskins said nothing. The interrogation continued for nearly 3 hours. Every question met with the same calm deflection. I don't remember. I bought it somewhere. You can't prove that. And in a way, he was right. The items in the toolbox were disturbing, but they weren't direct evidence of murder. Not yet. But then a forensic technician rushed into the room carrying something wrapped in an evidence bag. A small flip phone. Old. Scratched. But still recognizable. Greer looked at it carefully. Even after years, the device model looked familiar. Because investigators had studied the same type of phone countless times in the Melissa Carter file. Prepaid. Disposable. The kind used for that mysterious call at 7:14 p.m. on the night she vanished. The technician spoke quietly. We found it behind the workbench. Looks like it's been there a long time. Greer turned slowly toward Daniel Haskins. For the first time since the investigation began, the man's calm expression cracked. Just slightly. But enough. The phone would need forensic analysis before investigators could confirm anything. But if the device still contained the number used to call Melissa Carter, then after years of questions, they might finally have something undeniable. Something that would turn a suspect into a killer. Something that could finally explain what happened on that lonely Florida road back in 2003. But even as Greer watched Haskins sitting silently across the table, another thought crept into his mind. Because if the phone proved what they suspected, then the investigation wasn't just about solving Melissa Carter's disappearance anymore. It was about uncovering how many people had vanished before someone finally started digging in the right forest. And whether Daniel Haskins had truly stopped killing. Or if somewhere out there another victim was still waiting to be found. The phone looked harmless. Just a cheap grey flip phone sitting inside a clear evidence bag on the metal table in the forensic lab. Scratches covered the casing, and the plastic hinge had yellowed with age. It was the kind of device people bought at gas stations 20 years ago, used for a few calls, then thrown away without a second thought. Except this one hadn't been thrown away. Daniel Haskins had kept it. Hidden behind a workbench in his garage for years. Detective Alan Greer stood behind the glass wall of the lab watching technicians begin the extraction process. Digital forensics had come a long way since 2003, but recovering data from a device that old was still delicate work. The technician gently removed the battery. Good news, she said quietly. It hasn't leaked. That meant the phone's internal memory might still be intact. Greer felt a slow pulse building in his chest. For nearly a decade, investigators had chased a ghost, the prepaid phone that called Melissa Carter at 7:14 p.m. the night she vanished. A 34-second call. The last contact she ever received. If this phone turned out to be the same one, the entire case would change. Across town, Daniel Haskins sat in an interrogation room at the sheriff's department. He hadn't been arrested yet. The evidence wasn't strong enough for that. Not yet. But detectives weren't letting him leave either. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Haskins leaned back in his chair, arms folded, staring at the blank wall in front of him. Greer entered the room slowly. "You know why we're still talking," he said. Haskins didn't look at him. "Because you enjoy wasting your time." Greer pulled out the chair across from him. "We found the phone." That made Haskins' eyes flicker. Just once. But it was enough. "What phone?" he asked calmly. Greer placed a photograph on the table. The grey flip phone sealed in an evidence bag. Haskins studied it for a long moment. "Looks like a phone," he said. "You ever seen it before?" "No." The denial came instantly. Too quickly. Greer expected that. Men like Haskins didn't break easily. "You know what's interesting?" Greer continued quietly. "That phone is the exact same model used to call Melissa Carter the night she disappeared." Haskins shrugged. "Lots of people had those phones." Greer leaned forward. "Yeah. But most of them didn't hide them behind a workbench for 10 years. For the first time, the room fell silent. Haskins didn't respond. And Greer didn't push further. Because he knew the real answers weren't coming from this room. They were coming from the lab. Back at the forensic center, technicians carefully connected the phone to a digital extraction unit designed specifically for older devices. A progress bar slowly crept across the screen. 10%. 25%. Greer watched every second. Then finally the technician looked up. "We got something." The data appeared line by line on the monitor. Call logs. Text fragments. Battery records. And at the top of the call history, one number stood out immediately. August 17, 2003. 7:14 p.m. One outgoing call. 34 seconds. The number matched exactly. Melissa Carter's phone. For a moment nobody spoke. Greer felt the years of frustration collapse into a single overwhelming realization. The phone found in Daniel Haskins' garage had made the last call to Melissa Carter. The ghost in the investigation finally had a voice. And it belonged to him. The discovery moved quickly through the department. Within hours, prosecutors approved the next step. Daniel Haskins was formally placed under arrest. When deputies entered the interrogation room to read him his rights, he didn't resist. He simply nodded as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "About time," he said quietly. The remark sent a ripple of unease through the room. Because it sounded almost expected. Like a man who had known this moment would eventually arrive. The following morning, Greer sat across from Haskins again. But the atmosphere had changed completely. This time, the evidence sat between them. Photographs of the graves. The items found in the toolbox. The phone with Melissa Carter's number stored inside its memory. For the first time, Daniel Haskins was no longer just a suspect. He was the center of a growing storm. Greer spoke calmly. "We know you called her." Haskins said nothing. "We know you were near the gas station that night." Still silence. "And we know you drove the same road where her car was found." Greer slid the photo of the phone closer. "You want to explain that?" Haskins stared at the image. Then slowly leaned back in his chair. "What if I did call her?" he said finally. Greer didn't move. "That doesn't mean I killed anyone." The words hung in the air. Technically he was right. The phone proved contact. But it didn't prove murder. Yet. Greer remained calm. "Why did you call her?" Haskins smiled faintly. "I thought she might need help." "With what?" "Her car." The answer was so absurd it almost sounded rehearsed. Greer waited. Haskins continued. "I saw her leave the insurance office earlier that day. One of the tires looked low." The lie came smoothly. Too smoothly. Greer knew immediately it was nonsense. Melissa Carter's co-workers had confirmed she drove away normally that evening. No mechanical issues. No problems with the vehicle. But Haskins didn't care whether the story made sense. He was testing something. Testing how much investigators truly knew. Greer leaned forward slowly. "You followed her." Haskins' smile widened slightly. "Prove it." The challenge hung in the room like a spark near gasoline. Greer opened a folder and removed another photograph. The gas station footage. Melissa Carter standing beside the pump. And behind her the dark pickup truck. Recognize that vehicle. Haskins studied the image. Looks like a truck. Greer slid another photo beside it. The traffic camera frame from the intersection 8 miles away. The same truck. Same circular sticker. Heading toward the gas station minutes before Melissa arrived. Then Greer placed one final photo on the table. Haskins' own truck registration from 2003. Dark green Ford pickup. Circular Gulf Ridge decal. For a moment, the room went completely still. Then Haskins laughed. Not nervously. Not defensively. But genuinely amused. "You know what your problem is, detective," he said. Greer didn't respond. "You think solving one piece of the puzzle solves the whole thing?" The words were strange. Deliberate. Greer studied his face carefully. "What puzzle?" Haskins leaned forward now, resting his cuffed hands on the table. "That girl," he said quietly. "Melissa Carter." Greer's pulse quickened. "What about her?" Haskins held his gaze. "You're digging in the wrong woods." The sentence sent a sudden chill through the room. Greer didn't speak immediately. Because there were only two possibilities. Either Haskins was lying, or Melissa Carter had never been buried in the Gulf Ridge forest at all. And if that was true, then after years of searching the wrong place, the investigation might have just discovered something far more terrifying. Because somewhere else in Florida, there might be another location. Another place Daniel Haskins knew well. Another patch of ground still hiding the truth about what really happened the night Melissa Carter vanished. "You're digging in the wrong woods." The sentence echoed in Detective Alan Greer's mind long after the interrogation room door closed behind Daniel Haskins. For years, the Gulf Ridge Forest had been the center of the investigation. Bodies had been found there. Evidence tied Haskins to that land. It was the one place investigators finally believed they understood. But now the man sitting in a holding cell downstairs had casually suggested something else. Melissa Carter might never have been buried there. Greer sat alone in his office staring at the wall of photographs. Robert Leland. Angela Vickers. The other victims whose identities were still being confirmed. Red strings connected them to the forest clearing where their remains had been discovered. But Melissa's photograph sat slightly apart from the rest. Because after all the digging she was still missing. Greer replayed the interrogation in his head again and again. Haskins had a way of speaking that made it difficult to tell where truth ended and manipulation began. He enjoyed the game. Every answer felt carefully chosen, like pieces placed deliberately on a chessboard. "You're digging in the wrong woods." Was it a lie meant to confuse investigators? Or a hint? If Melissa wasn't buried in Gulf Ridge, where was she? Greer began retracing Haskins' life again from the beginning. Every job. Every property he had visited. Every road he had driven regularly during the early 2000s. Construction records filled his desk. Old payroll documents. Job site permits from companies Haskins had worked for across 2 counties. One address kept appearing in those files. A highway expansion project completed in late 2003. Just months after Melissa Carter disappeared. The project site sat about 20 miles south of the gas station where she had stopped the night she vanished. Greer pulled up the map. The road construction had taken place along a rural stretch of highway surrounded by undeveloped land, thick brush, drainage canals, and patches of empty farmland that had since grown wild. At the time, dozens of construction workers had spent months operating heavy machinery there. Bulldozers. Excavators. Trucks moving tons of soil every day. Greer felt a slow realization forming. If someone wanted to hide something permanently, a construction site would be perfect. Ground disturbed constantly. Fresh earth moved daily. Anything buried there would vanish beneath layers of asphalt and concrete within weeks. Greer stood up immediately and headed for the evidence board. Melissa Carter disappeared in August 2003. The highway project began 2 weeks later. Daniel Haskins had been employed there as part of a subcontracting crew. The timing felt too precise to be coincidence. Greer returned to the interrogation room that afternoon. Daniel Haskins sat calmly at the metal table again, as if he had been expecting another visit. "You look busy," Haskins said. Greer ignored the comment. You worked highway construction in September 2003. Haskins shrugged. I worked a lot of places. You worked a site south of Clearwater. State Highway 47 expansion. Another shrug. Maybe. Greer placed a photograph of the construction site on the table. Rows of heavy machinery. Fresh trenches carved into the earth. Massive piles of dirt waiting to be moved. You remember digging trenches there? Haskins leaned forward slightly to look. Then he smiled again. That was a long time ago. Greer studied him carefully. Funny thing about construction sites, Greer said quietly. Lots of digging. No response. Lots of places to hide things. Haskins' smile faded slightly. But only slightly. You think I buried someone in the middle of a state highway project? He asked. Greer didn't answer immediately. Because the idea sounded almost impossible. But impossible things happen when someone has the right opportunity. And Daniel Haskins had worked those machines. He had access to the land. Access to the equipment. Access to the exact moment when soil was being moved and covered again. Greer leaned closer. You told me we were digging in the wrong woods. Haskins remained silent. So tell me where we should be digging. For the first time, the man's expression changed in a way Greer hadn't seen before. Not fear. Something closer to curiosity. You really want to know? Haskins asked. Greer held his gaze. Yes. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Then Haskins leaned back slowly. Too late, he said. Greer felt a flash of anger. Why? Haskins nodded toward the photograph of the highway project. Because that road's been finished for 20 years. The meaning hit Greer instantly. Concrete. Asphalt. Miles of pavement laid directly over the construction trenches. If Melissa Carter had been buried there, she might now be lying beneath a highway thousands of cars drove across every day. The realization felt like a punch to the chest. Back in Greer's office, investigators immediately began reviewing the construction project in detail. Old engineering plans were pulled from state archives. Satellite imagery from 2003 was compared with modern maps. The highway expansion had covered nearly 3 miles of land. Dozens of trenches had been dug during the project. Some reaching 12 feet deep before being filled and paved over. The scale made the problem terrifying. If Melissa Carter had been buried anywhere within that zone, finding her now would require tearing apart sections of a major roadway. A task that could cost millions. And require proof strong enough to justify it. Right now, investigators only had a theory. But as Greer studied the construction records further, another disturbing detail appeared. On August 21, 2003, 4 days after Melissa disappeared, one trench near mile marker 18 had been filled unexpectedly early. The schedule originally planned for that section to remain open another week. But the site supervisor had authorized an early fill due to unstable soil conditions. Greer tracked down the supervisor. The man was retired now, living in a quiet coastal town 2 hours away. When detectives showed him the records, he squinted at the paperwork trying to remember something from 20 years earlier. Finally, the memory surfaced. There was a problem with one of the workers, he said. Greer leaned forward. What kind of problem? The supervisor rubbed his chin. Guy named Haskins. I remember that name because we almost fired him. Greer felt his pulse quicken. What happened? The old man looked toward the window, thinking. He showed up early that morning. Before anyone else got there. Why? Claimed he wanted to get a head start on the trench work. The supervisor paused. But when the rest of the crew arrived, the trench was already partially filled. Greer felt a chill crawl down his spine. You mean he started filling it by himself? The supervisor nodded slowly. Yeah. And when we asked him why, he said the soil looked unstable. Greer asked the question he already feared. Was it? The man shook his head. No. Greer's mind raced. Daniel Haskins had arrived alone at a construction site just days after Melissa Carter vanished. He had access to heavy machinery. He had filled a trench earlier than scheduled. And 20 years later that exact trench now lay buried beneath a stretch of highway. If the theory was correct, the truth about Melissa Carter might be lying somewhere beneath the asphalt of State Highway 47. But proving it would be another challenge entirely. Because digging up a highway required extraordinary evidence. And right now all they had was the word of a man who seemed to enjoy watching investigators chase ghosts. Still, Greer couldn't ignore the possibility. Because if Daniel Haskins had buried Melissa Carter there, then for 2 decades, thousands of cars had unknowingly passed over the final resting place of a woman whose disappearance had haunted an entire community. And somewhere beneath that endless ribbon of pavement, the truth might still be waiting. State Highway 47 never sleeps. Day and night, a constant river of headlights and engines moves across its asphalt surface. Commuters rushing to work. Truck drivers hauling cargo across counties. Families traveling through Florida without ever noticing the quiet stretch of road beneath their tires. To most people, it's just another highway. But to Detective Alan Greer, it had suddenly become something else entirely. A grave. For days, Greer stood beside the roadside shoulder studying traffic flow, watching thousands of vehicles pass over the same section of pavement. The sun baked the asphalt under the late summer heat while trucks thundered past only a few feet away. Somewhere beneath that road, according to Daniel Haskins' chilling suggestion, Melissa Carter might be lying buried. The idea sounded almost impossible. And yet the evidence kept pointing back to that construction site in 2003. The timeline fit too well. Melissa disappeared August 17th. Daniel Haskins showed up alone at the construction trench for days later. And that same trench was mysteriously filled ahead of schedule. The road now covering it had been poured less than 48 hours afterward. Concrete. Asphalt. 20 years of traffic sealing whatever lay beneath. Back at the Sheriff's Department, Greer gathered a meeting with engineers from the Florida Department of Transportation. They spread blueprints across the conference table, large maps showing every layer beneath Highway 47. Foundation gravel. Reinforced concrete. Asphalt surfacing. Below that the original soil. Greer pointed to mile marker 18. This trench here, he said. How deep was it? One of the engineers adjusted his glasses. About 11 feet during construction. And after it was filled, concrete slab poured over the top. Roughly 18 inches thick. Greer exhaled slowly. That meant if something had been buried there before the fill was completed, it would now be sealed beneath layers of earth and concrete nearly 15 feet deep. Digging through that wasn't impossible. But it would be massive. The highway would need to be closed. Sections removed. Excavation teams brought in. Millions of dollars spent based on a theory that still lacked direct proof. One of the engineers leaned back in his chair. You're saying someone might be buried under the highway? Greer nodded. The room grew quiet. Then the engineer spoke carefully. If that's true, we'd need a very precise location before even considering excavation. And that was the problem. The trench ran nearly 200 feet along that section of road. Without knowing exactly where to dig, investigators could spend weeks tearing apart pavement without finding anything. Greer left the meeting frustrated but not defeated. Because Daniel Haskins still had one piece of the puzzle investigators needed. The exact spot. And the only way to get it was to make him talk. Later that evening, Greer returned to the interrogation room. Haskins sat calmly again, his cuffed hands resting on the metal table. You've been busy, Haskins said when Greer entered. Greer ignored the comment. You worked trench number 12 at the highway site. Haskins didn't respond. You arrived early that morning before the rest of the crew. Silence. You filled the trench before anyone else got there. Haskins tilted his head slightly. Construction work gets done faster when you show initiative. Greer placed the highway blueprint on the table. You buried her there. The words hung heavy in the air. Haskins looked down at the map slowly. Then he chuckled under his breath. You still think this is about one girl? Greer stared at him. What does that mean? Haskins leaned forward slightly. You've been digging in the woods. Yes. You found bodies. Greer's jaw tightened. Yes. Haskins' eyes gleamed faintly. And you still think that was the whole story? Greer felt a cold tension creeping into his chest. How many? He asked quietly. Haskins didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the ceiling as if remembering something distant. People disappear every day, detective. Greer slammed his hand on the table. How many? The sudden force echoed through the small room. For a moment, Haskins simply watched him. Then he spoke softly. More than you found. The answer sent a chill through Greer's spine. Because if that was true, the graves discovered in the Gulf Ridge woods might only be a fraction of the truth. Greer leaned forward again. You want to play games? Fine. He pointed to the blueprint. Tell me where Melissa Carter is buried. Haskins studied the map quietly. Then he pointed. Not to the trench Greer expected, but to another section of highway. Mile marker 21. 3 miles further down the road. Greer felt confusion surge through him. That trench wasn't filled early, he said. Haskins smiled faintly. No. Greer stared at the map again. If Haskins was telling the truth, Melissa Carter wasn't buried in Trench 12. She was buried somewhere else along the project. Which meant investigators had been focusing on the wrong section entirely. Greer looked back at him sharply. Why lie earlier? Haskins shrugged. You asked the wrong question. The frustration built inside Greer again. You expect me to believe you're suddenly helping us? Haskins leaned back calmly. No. Then why tell me anything? The answer came quietly. Because you're close. Greer's pulse quickened. Close to what? Haskins smiled again. To understanding. The cryptic response made Greer want to drag the truth out of him right there. But he forced himself to stay calm. Why Melissa Carter? He asked. Haskins studied him carefully. Then his voice dropped slightly. She wasn't supposed to be different. The sentence made Greer pause. What does that mean? Haskins looked down at the table. For years they were just moments. Moments. Passing through someone's life. Greer didn't like the direction the conversation was going. You're talking about killing people. Haskins shrugged faintly. You say killing. I say silence. Greer felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. Why her? Haskins looked up slowly. Because she fought. The words hung in the air like something heavy and dangerous. Greer leaned closer. What happened on that road? For a long moment, Daniel Haskins said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. She wasn't supposed to stop at that gas station. Greer felt the pieces shifting again. You followed her there. Haskins didn't deny it. And when she drove away? The man's eyes grew distant. I thought she'd keep going. But she didn't. Haskins shook his head slowly. No. Greer felt his pulse pounding now. What happened next? For the first time since the interrogation began, Haskins hesitated. Then he looked directly at Greer. You want to know where she is? Yes. The answer came instantly. Haskins leaned back again. Then you're going to have to dig up a highway. The words landed like a final challenge. Because whether Haskins was lying or not, there was now only one way to find out. And that meant something no investigator in the room had ever attempted before. Tearing open a section of State Highway 47. Digging through layers of concrete and soil. Searching for the remains of a woman who had disappeared 20 years earlier. But as Greer walked out of the interrogation room that night, another thought gnawed at him. Because Daniel Haskins had said something else. Something even more disturbing. She wasn't supposed to be different. Which meant Melissa Carter's story might not have begun on that lonely road in 2003. It might have started much earlier. With another victim. Another disappearance. And a pattern investigators were only now beginning to see. The words wouldn't leave Greer's mind. She wasn't supposed to be different. Daniel Haskins had spoken them quietly, almost casually, but they lingered like something poisonous in the investigation. They suggested something detectives had already begun to fear but hadn't fully said out loud yet. Melissa Carter wasn't the beginning. She was part of a pattern. Back in the sheriff's department, Greer stood alone in the evidence room staring at the wall of missing persons photographs investigators had assembled over the past week. Faces from different years. Different towns. Different lives. But slowly, connections had begun appearing between them. Robert Leland, 1998. Angela Vickers, 2005. 2 victims already confirmed buried in the Gulf Ridge forest. But there were others whose disappearances now looked far less random than they once did. A waitress named Laura McKenna who vanished in 2001 after closing a diner late at night. A college student named Eric Dalton reported missing after his car was found abandoned along a rural road in 1999. A hitchhiker whose identity had never even been confirmed, last seen climbing into a pickup truck in 2002. Greer studied the map beside the photographs. Pushpins marked the locations where each person had last been seen. When connected together, they formed an unsettling shape stretching across the same network of quiet highways and wooded backroads Daniel Haskins had traveled for years. The pattern was undeniable now. The man investigators had been chasing as a suspect in one disappearance might have been hunting victims for more than a decade. And if Haskins' words meant what Greer suspected, Melissa Carter had disrupted that pattern somehow. She had been different. But why? Greer returned to the interrogation room again the next morning. Haskins looked almost relaxed sitting there. As if being surrounded by detectives and concrete walls was simply another part of his routine now. "You look tired," Haskins said when Greer entered. Greer ignored the remark. "You've been doing this a long time." Haskins tilted his head slightly. "Doing what?" "Killing people." The room fell quiet again. Haskins didn't react. Greer placed several photographs on the table. Robert Leland. Angela Vickers. Laura McKenna. Eric Dalton. For faces staring silently from the paper. "Which ones were you?" Greer asked. Haskins studied the images carefully. Then he pointed at Robert Leland. "That one talked too much." Greer felt the air shift. For the first time, Haskins had acknowledged something directly connected to a victim. "What do you mean?" Haskins shrugged slightly. "Some people don't know when to mind their business." Greer kept his voice steady. "You killed him." Haskins didn't answer. But he didn't deny it either. Greer slid Angela Vickers' photograph forward. "And her?" For a moment, Haskins' expression changed again. Not fear. Something closer to irritation. "She wasn't careful," he said quietly. The sentence sent a chill through the room. "What does that mean?" Haskins leaned back slowly. "People who travel alone at night should pay more attention." Greer felt anger tightening his jaw. "You hunted them." Haskins looked almost amused. You're the one calling it hunting. The conversation had taken a dark turn. Greer knew he had to steer it back to the question that mattered most. Melissa Carter. Why was she different? Greer asked. For the first time, Haskins looked genuinely thoughtful. He stared at the table for a long moment before answering. She saw me. The simple sentence sent a ripple through Greer's mind. What do you mean? At the gas station. Haskins' voice remained calm. She noticed the truck. Greer remembered the surveillance footage instantly. Melissa standing beside the pump. The dark pickup truck parked behind her. Engine running. Lights off. You were watching her, Greer said. Haskins nodded slightly. That's when things changed. Greer leaned forward. Explain. Haskins exhaled slowly. Usually people don't look twice. Usually. They're tired. Distracted. Thinking about where they're going. Greer understood what he meant. Most people never notice the vehicles around them. But Melissa Carter had. She saw you watching, Greer said. Haskins nodded again. And that made her suspicious. Exactly. Greer felt the timeline sharpening. So she left. Yes. And you followed her. Another nod. The pieces were finally aligning. Melissa Carter left the gas station around 7:45 p.m. She drove north along the rural highway. And somewhere along that dark stretch of road Daniel Haskins caught up with her. Greer asked the question carefully. Did you force her off the road? Haskins shook his head. No. Then why did she stop? The man smiled faintly again. Because she thought something was wrong with her car. Greer's mind flashed back to the phone call. The prepaid phone hidden in Haskins' garage. You called her, Greer said. Yes. What did you tell her? Haskins leaned forward slightly. That her tire looked loose. The same lie he had attempted earlier. But this time, it fit the timeline perfectly. Melissa receives the call at 7:14 p.m. Someone warning her about a problem with her vehicle. By the time she leaves the gas station and begins driving again, she's already thinking about it. Watching her mirrors. Listening for strange sounds. And when the pickup truck pulls up beside her on the highway, the driver waves urgently toward her wheels. She believes him. She pulls over. Exactly where Daniel Haskins wants her. Greer felt his chest tighten. What happened when she stopped? Haskins didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands. She stepped out of the car, he said finally. And? She realized too late. Greer leaned closer. Realized what? Haskins looked up slowly. That I wasn't there to help. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Greer spoke again. What did you do to her? For a moment, Daniel Haskins' eyes drifted toward the ceiling. Then he said something unexpected. She fought harder than the others. The statement landed like a hammer. What happened next? Greer asked quietly. Haskins shook his head slightly. That part doesn't matter. It matters to her family. The man shrugged. She's been gone a long time. Greer's patience finally snapped. You murdered her and buried her under a highway. Haskins didn't react to the accusation. Instead, he studied Greer with that same unsettling calm. You still think the highway is the important part. Greer stared at him. What are you talking about? Haskins leaned forward again. The road just hides the truth. Greer felt a sudden tension rising in his chest. What truth? Haskins smiled faintly. The one you haven't figured out yet. The cryptic answer made Greer's pulse spike. Because every time Haskins spoke, it felt like the investigation moved one step forward and 2 steps deeper into something darker. Greer grabbed the blueprint of Highway 47 again. You pointed to mile marker 21. Haskins nodded. Yes. That's where Melissa Carter is buried. Another nod. Greer held his gaze. And if we dig there? For the first time, Daniel Haskins' smile faded completely. You'll find something. The word sounded almost like a promise. But Greer noticed something else in the man's expression now. Something subtle. Not fear. But anticipation. As if the truth buried beneath that highway might reveal something even investigators weren't prepared to see. And if Daniel Haskins was telling the truth, then somewhere beneath mile marker 21 of State Highway 47, Melissa Carter had been waiting for 20 years to be found. But the real question was something far more disturbing. What else might be buried down there with her? The decision to dig up a highway is not one any investigator makes lightly. By the time the proposal reached the Florida Department of Transportation, it had already passed through layers of skepticism, legal review, and quiet disbelief. The idea sounded almost surreal when spoken out loud in conference rooms. A woman missing since 2003. A suspect now sitting in custody after the discovery of 2 bodies in a remote forest. And a claim, unverified, unproven, that the victim might be buried beneath a section of State Highway 47. It sounded like something out of a crime novel. But the evidence was starting to pile up in ways investigators could no longer ignore. Daniel Haskins had known details about Melissa Carter's disappearance that had never been made public. He had led police to 2 confirmed graves connected to earlier victims. And now he had pointed directly to a location 3 miles down the highway construction project he had worked on the week Melissa vanished. Detective Alan Greer stood before a long table inside the county administrative building, presenting the case to a room filled with engineers, prosecutors, and transportation officials. The highway map glowed on a screen behind him. Melissa Carter disappeared August 17, 2003, Greer said calmly. 4 days later, Daniel Haskins arrived alone at a trench excavation during a highway expansion project. Workers reported that the trench was filled earlier than scheduled. He paused, letting the room absorb the information. 2 weeks later, concrete was poured over that entire section. One of the engineers leaned forward. You're asking us to shut down part of a major highway based on a suspect's word? Greer nodded. Yes. The engineer folded his arms. That road carries nearly 30,000 vehicles a day. I understand. And you want to tear it apart. Greer didn't flinch. If there's a body under that road, we owe it to the victim to find her. The room went quiet again. Because everyone there understood what that meant. Not just a road closure. Heavy excavation equipment. Weeks of disruption. Millions of dollars in costs. All to test a theory that might lead nowhere. Finally, the county prosecutor spoke up. There's another factor. The room turned toward her. If we don't investigate this claim and it turns out to be true later, the legal consequences could be enormous. That statement changed the tone immediately. Because ignoring a credible lead in a homicide investigation could haunt the department for decades. The transportation director sighed slowly. You have a precise location? Greer nodded. Mile marker 21. Section C of the original trench project. The man rubbed his forehead. That's directly beneath the westbound lanes. How deep? Concrete slab about 18 inches thick. Under that, 6 feet of fill material before the original soil. Greer had already memorized those numbers. Which meant the excavation team would have to cut through asphalt, remove concrete slabs, dig through compacted gravel and dirt. Before reaching the earth beneath. If anything had been buried there in 2003, it would be sealed beneath layers of construction almost impossible to disturb naturally. In other words, if Melissa Carter was there, she had been hidden perfectly. 2 days later, the decision was made. State Highway 47 would close a half-mile stretch near mile marker 21 for forensic excavation. The announcement spread through the community like wildfire. Local news stations interrupted programming with breaking coverage. Helicopters circled above the site as construction crews arrived before dawn to begin preparations. Traffic was diverted to nearby county roads, creating miles of congestion. Drivers complained. Businesses worried about lost revenue. But for the Carter family, none of that mattered. After 20 years, investigators were finally searching for Melissa again. And this time, they were digging beneath a highway. Early Monday morning, the excavation began. The first step was cutting through the asphalt. Industrial saws roared as crews carved clean rectangular lines into the surface of the westbound lanes. Sparks flew as blades sliced through pavement hardened by 2 decades of Florida heat and traffic. Once the asphalt sections were removed, the concrete slab beneath became visible. It was thick, reinforced with steel rebar. Exactly the kind of barrier that made highway construction strong enough to last decades. It also made the search far more difficult. Jackhammers began pounding the concrete apart piece by piece. Chunks were lifted away by cranes and stacked along the roadside. Hour after hour, the sound of machinery echoed across the quiet stretch of road. Television cameras captured everything from a distance. Reporters spoke in hushed tones about the possibility that a missing woman might finally be found beneath the pavement. But as the concrete disappeared and excavation crews began digging into the packed earth below, the tension only grew. Detective Greer stood near the edge of the excavation pit watching every movement carefully. Beside him, forensic specialists waited with equipment ready. So far, nothing had appeared. Just layers of gravel and dirt. But Haskins had been specific. 6 feet down. That was the depth of the original trench before the concrete had been poured. The backhoe lowered its bucket again. Another scoop of soil lifted into the air, dumped beside the pit. And then something changed. The operator paused. Greer stepped closer. "What is it?" The man pointed into the trench. "Something down there looks different." Greer climbed down into the pit carefully. The soil color had shifted slightly in one section. Darker. Looser. Like earth that had been disturbed long ago and then compacted again. Forensic teams moved in immediately. From that moment forward, heavy machinery stopped. Every shovel of dirt would now be removed by hand. Because if Melissa Carter was buried here, one wrong movement could destroy the evidence investigators had waited 2 decades to find. Hours passed as the team worked slowly through the soil. Then a technician froze. "Detective." Greer moved closer. Half buried in the dirt, something pale had appeared. At first it was just a shape. A curve. Then the technician brushed away more soil with careful fingers. And the truth emerged from the ground. Bone. Human bone. For a moment, no one spoke. The entire excavation site seemed to fall silent as investigators stared at the discovery lying beneath the highway. A skull. Partially buried. Facing upward toward the sky. 20 years in darkness. 20 years beneath thousands of passing vehicles. And now, finally, the victim was beginning to surface. Greer felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Because Daniel Haskins had been telling the truth. Melissa Carter had been there all along. Hidden beneath the road where no one would ever think to search. But as forensic teams continued carefully uncovering the remains, something else quickly became clear. Something far more disturbing. Because the bones they were uncovering didn't look like a single skeleton. There were too many. More fragments appearing in the soil. More shapes emerging beneath careful brushes and gloved hands. Greer felt a slow, creeping dread rise in his mind. If what he was seeing was real, then Melissa Carter might not be the only person buried beneath that highway.